If you would open up your Bibles to the book of Joshua. We're going to be camping, if you will, in the book of Joshua tonight, and primarily in chapter 6, as we are going to be considering the account of Jericho, an account that is familiar to all of us here, I'm sure, and one that, if we've been in the church very long at all, that you've heard told time and time again. And it's one of those stories that we typically tell our young children about. It's one of those more famous of tales, if you will, that we recount because of the epic nature of the conquest here, as the Israelites were finally entering into the promised land and conquering the peoples there. And the first real major battle that they have is the Battle of Jericho. And in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 30, throughout the book of Hebrews, or primarily in chapter 11, we have the Hebrew writer recounting all these heroes of faith and these great things that happened through or by faith. And one of the things that is cited there in that chapter, which again plays to the significance of this account, is what we read there in verse 30, where it says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days." And so I'd like us to begin by reading the first portion of Joshua chapter 6, which gives us some background here about what's going on. And we read about the commands that were given to the Israelites in regards to what they were to do in order to be successful in conquering this truly fortified city. And we're going to talk quite a bit as we begin our lesson about how fortified and how daunting of a task it truly would have been, especially without the Lord's help, to be able to go and conquer a city such as this. So here in Joshua 6 and starting in verse 1, we read that Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all you men of war, you shall go all around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priest shall blow the trumpets. It shall come to pass when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up every man straight before him." So then Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Proceed and march around the city, and let him who is armed advance before the ark of the Lord." And so it was, when Joshua had spoken to the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord advanced and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. And Joshua had commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I say to you, shout. Then you shall shout." So he had the ark of the Lord circle the city, going around it once. And they came into the camp and lodged in the camp. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark went on continually and blew with the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came again after the ark. In verse 14, the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp, and so they did for 6 days. So obviously the 7th day is the pinnacle day, and we'll get to that here in just a few moments. I want us to consider the way that Jericho was and really still is laid out. Of course, the original city today is not inhabited, it is ruins. But archaeologists over the years have done a number of excavations into the original location of Jericho and pretty much have established how it was set up and the approximate height of the various walls that encircled that city. And so I have a diagram here on the PowerPoint for us to consider, which more or less kind of shows you how the city was constructed, and I think highlights for us just how impressive it would have been to behold this, and really how scary it would have been to think about trying to go up against this city and to take it because of how fortified it truly was. The city of Jericho is built upon a large hill or mound, and there was a base wall that was built right up against that hill, and that wall was approximately 15 feet high. Now, at the top of that supporting wall or foundational wall was the first actual wall that went from the ground up, and then as you went up the hill a little ways, there was a second wall, and both of those walls were approximately 25 feet high. So between the outer wall and the inner wall, obviously there would have been dwellings there and people living there, and then inside the second wall would have been additional and more important structures, such as the king's palace and things of that nature. But if you consider just standing at ground level and beholding this city with the supporting wall, the foundational wall, and then the first initial wall built up upon that, you're looking at roughly 45 feet high. And that's, about equivalent to a 4-story building. So if you can imagine, coming up as an army or just a lone soldier and beholding this, that's impressive. That's daunting. How am I going to be able to come up and take this city? And once I get over that first massive wall, then I've got another one inside that I've got to get through in order to get in there and truly take the city. So again, we can see how human reasoning would say, well, this is a foolish attempt. This is silly. And even as we look at the commands or instructions that were given to the Israelites, just from a purely humanistic or worldly viewpoint, you got to look at that and say, well, what are you guys doing here? You're marching around a city and you're blowing trumpets, and then we're going to see on the seventh day they march around 7 times and then they start yelling. But by human logic, you just look like a bunch of fools out there. You're not going to accomplish anything. But we see that the result was far different than what any human scholar could have predicted. And so we continue where we had left off there in chapter 6 and verse 15. It says, "It came to pass on the 7th day that they again rose early about the dawning of the day, and they marched around the city, not 1 time, as they'd done the previous 6, but 7 times in the same manner. And on that day only marched they around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened, when the priest blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people, 'Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent.'" We'll talk more about her and the promise that was made to her as we move on. But verse 18 says, "You by all means abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it." We know Achan, of course, was guilty of that as we continue reading in the book of Joshua. But verse 19, they're told that all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. And so the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets. And it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat. And the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. And so as we come back to the diagram that we had there, and we think about what was told to the Israelites as far as how this was going to happen. The Lord said, you do this in the way that I prescribe, as silly as it might seem, and the walls will fall down flat. And the key thing is that they would go up, every man straight before him, into the city. So how would that have happened so as to accomplish being able to go up straight before into the city? Because again, we've got this retaining wall along the base there, you recall. Well, this is what happened. The walls fell outward and they fell flat. And what happened, what that enabled, was for the Israelites to do just what God had said would happen. As that first wall that was built upon the foundation wall fell flat, what did it create? It created a ramp for them to walk up into the city. And then, of course, as the second wall had likewise fallen flat, they had no problem proceeding on in to the innermost parts of the city as well. And so again, Joshua 6:5, highlighting the language that was used, the people shall go up, every man straight before him. Again, in verse 20, the people indeed went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. Now, how do we know the walls fell like that? Well, as archaeologists have dug and uncovered the city and the remains, that's exactly what they found. That's exactly how it was preserved and is preserved. And so it's really quite remarkable. You know, the account of Jericho is really so significant, not just because of the story itself and what we learn from it as far as our faith and what faith can accomplish, but also the amount of archaeological evidence that exists to back up the Bible's account just as it's recorded and all the minor details. And we're going to note more of those as we continue through the lesson. But we definitely see, as we consider this account, that God's way works. Even though it might not make sense to us, even though it might seem silly, for whatever reason, God's way always works. And we definitely see that in the account of Jericho. As we think about man's wisdom, and again, thinking about specifically this conquest of this city, well, we're told in the scriptures, just the previous chapters of the book of Joshua, and we'll notice some verses here as you come back to chapter 2, but there was but one way in and out of the city, and that was through the main gate. Back here in Joshua chapter 2, you notice in verse 5, as Rahab is giving her account to the guards as to what happened to the messengers that Joshua had sent to the city to spy it out. She says, it happened as the gate was being shut when it was dark, that the men went out, and where the men went I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them. Down in verse 7 there, we find that the men who she had told this to, they pursued them by the road to the Jordan, to the fords. As soon as those who pursued them had gone out, notice, they shut the gate, knowing that that was the one way in and out. They were very, very zealous about making sure it was kept closed, and as people came in and out, it was immediately shut and secured. In verse 15, we find that in order to get them out of the city, there wasn't any other door, there wasn't any other entryway. And so what did she do? Well, she let them down, we read there, by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall, and she dwelt on the wall. Now we also understand, based upon what we read in the preceding chapters here about what time of year this was, that the Israelites were coming up against Jericho to besiege it. Well, it was the harvest. So they had just reaped the fruits of all their crops, and the city was stocked. And so, we're told that the siege of Jericho lasted for 7 days. But by all human estimation, a siege by normal standards would have gone on for who knows how long. Because, okay, we just got all of our supplies for the year. good luck. We'll see in a year or whatever it's going to be. So they could have stayed holed up inside the city and been just fine for a good amount of time. And chapter 3 here in verse 15, there's interjected there in the last part of that verse. It says, the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of the harvest. And of course, this is the point where the Israelites were crossing the Jordan River to go over and take the city. And also, if we jump back to chapter 2 once again, looking at verse 6, we have explained to us where Rahab had hidden the spies, and you notice that she hid them under the stalks of flax that she had out on her roof. And so again is indicative of the fact that this was the harvest. They had just reaped the fruit of all of their crops, and they were good to go for a very long period of time. And so a siege, which would be the normal way that you would go about taking a city of this magnitude and fortification, would be a silly thing to engage in. As we go back to some further archaeological accounts that, again, I want us to notice these because they correlate or correspond to the facts that we have contained here in the biblical account and show us that indeed God's word is true. But archaeologists, two of them, one by the name of Garstang and the other Kenyon, as they had their excavation of Jericho, they found many storage jars full of grain. So these weren't half used or almost empty, but these were full jars of grain. And the interesting thing about it is that these jars were very evidently caught in a fiery destruction. And so as the archaeological account continues, it talks about how, this is a unique find, because normally if you excavate a city that had been besieged, you don't find full jars of grain. You don't find supplies or evidence of supplies left over, because if it was a siege, then, well, they used up all those supplies until they didn't have anything and they were all dying, and then that enabled the enemy to finally be able to go in and conquer the city. So we know that grain was valuable not only as a source of food, but also it was used to barter and to trade. And we see an example of that in 1 Kings chapter 5. Verses 10 and 11 there, as Solomon was making preparation to build the temple, he needed cedar. And one of the men who he contracted to provide him that cedar, the payment in return was oil, and also it was grain as well. Those were the two things that Solomon used to pay for that wood. And so this confirms that the inhabitants of Jericho did not escape, else they would have taken the grain with them. And also, again, that the city did indeed fall in the short period of time that we have described, in the 7 days. Again, if it had been a long siege, the grain would have all been consumed by the inhabitants of the city. Jeremiah 33 and verse 3, the Lord says, "Call to me, and I will answer you, and I will show you great and mighty things which you do not know." Ephesians 3 and verse 20, again talking to the greatness of God and how He is so far beyond you and I. His ways are higher than our ways and greater than our ways. We read, "Now to Him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to Him be glory in the church by Jesus Christ to all generations, forever and ever. Amen." Hebrews 3 and verse 4 reminds us that every house is built by someone, but He who built all things is God. And so if God wants the walls to fall down flat in response to a group of Israelites shouting and blowing trumpets, then it's going to happen, because He built all things and is in control of all things. As we had mentioned earlier, we certainly see from this account the ideas of grace and belief and obedience all brought to the forefront, and how all those things work together. How if we want to experience God's grace, God's power and help, and His salvation, then we have to believe and obey Him. And that's exactly what the Israelites did. They heard the instruction, they believed it enough to the point that they obeyed it, just as it had been given. And as they did that, God bestowed His grace upon them. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6 tells us that without faith it is impossible to please God, for he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those that diligently seek Him. In Romans chapter 5, we have here highlighted the fact that it is that obedient faith that enables us to experience God's grace and to continue to stand in God's grace. Romans chapter 5 and the first 2 verses. It says, "Therefore, having been justified by faith," notice that, "we have peace with God through Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access," again, by faith, "into this grace in which we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of God." You know, one of the verses that many people like to hone in on, especially those that would be proponents of the idea that belief alone is really what constitutes faith, and as long as we have that belief, then we can be saved. And so often it is that type of teaching that goes hand in hand with the idea of, well, you just say this prayer, or you just reach out and touch your television, or something along those lines. But you don't really have to do anything as long as you believe. That's what a lot of people teach and what a lot of people follow today, sadly. And one of the verses, like I was saying, that they will often hone in on is John 3:16. "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life." We'll see it right there. Whoever believes should have everlasting life. But I want us to notice in the context of John 3, in that very same context, in verse 36, we read the following. And really it's more or less a reiteration of the same idea that was talked about in verse 16. But it says, "He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him." You might say, well, what's your point? It says the same thing there as it does in verse 16. But if we go to what the Greek word is there that is translated "does not believe," it's rather interesting. And in some of the more modern translations of the New Testament, we find that it is more accurately interpreted or conveyed. But the Greek word is apatheo, which is defined as disobeying, rebelling, being disloyal, or refusing to conform. So that's a little bit different from the idea of just believing something, right? Or not believing something. This is more or less not going along with the commands that one is given. And so as we look at, again, some of the other translations, and actually, of course, the American Standard Version is not necessarily a newer translation, but more accurately conveys the meaning of the Greek word there. But the wording in the New American Standard is "he who does not obey the Son." And in the New International Version, we have "whoever rejects the Son," which again more accurately conveys that. So I bring that up just as a means to reason with those that might have that type of a perspective, and who would maybe go to that verse to back up that type of teaching. And you can show them within the same context how that does not mesh with the teaching of the Bible. Are we walking by faith today? You know, in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7 tells us that we walk by faith and not by sight. And back in Numbers chapter 13, you recall how when Moses was leading the Israelites initially there out of Egyptian bondage, and they had come to the promised land, and the plan was for them to go ahead and proceed and take the land that God had given them. But they had sent the 12 spies, as you recall, And Joshua, interestingly enough, was one of those spies. He and Caleb were the only two who brought back the positive report. But we see here an example of what I think we see even today is most people walk by sight and not by faith. But in verse 26 there of Numbers 13, it says, "They departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. They told him and said, 'We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit.'" They brought back examples. "Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large." No doubt they had beheld Jericho even then and saw how fortified and large it was. "Moreover," they go on to say, "we saw the descendants of Anak there." In other words, the giants. Well, we see what became of those who brought back that negative report and the ones who had dissuaded the people from doing what God had instructed them and told them that he would be with them in doing. Verse 36 of Numbers 14 says, "The men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation complain against him by bringing a bad report of the land, those very men who brought the evil report about the land died by the plague of the Lord." In Mark chapter 9, I think we see here an example of a man who certainly believed in Jesus, but yet acknowledged at the same time that he could do even better than he was doing. And I think that maybe all of us at some point or another kind of fall into that same place where, yeah, we believe, but for whatever reason our faith is kind of shaken. And we need to take note, I think, of what we see here in this example where Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." You remember the sick child at the time and the father who had come to plead with Jesus to heal the child. But notice what the father says in response to what Jesus had said. Immediately the father cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And so we walk by faith, but not by sight. But there are times when we need to, I think, ask God to help us in our unbelief, because we allow the anxieties of this world to shake us sometimes. One of the things that we certainly see in this account is that God keeps his word. God always keeps his word. When he makes a promise, he follows through with it. And we can cite a couple of specific promises in connection with Jericho, not just the instruction given about the conquering of the city alone, but some additional things, additional promises that were also made in connection with these events that we again see God fulfilling, just as he had stated them. And the first of which is the promise that was made to Rahab. And we had referenced this earlier. But you come back to Joshua chapter 2, and we can read about the initial promise that was made to her because she helped the Israelite spies. Joshua 2, and beginning in verse 12 there, says, "Therefore I beg you," and this is her speaking to them, "swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death." She very much knew that the Israelites were going to accomplish what they came to do because God was with them. And so she's asking, please, spare us. Spare my family. Spare our possessions. And verse 14, the men answered her, "Our lives for yours, if none of you tell this business of ours. And it shall be when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you." So we come back over here to chapter 6, where we had left off earlier in verse 21, and we pick up there in verse 22, and we can see how this promise was indeed fulfilled. Verse 22 there, it says, "Joshua, who had said to the two men who had spied out the country, 'Go into the harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her.' The young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, all that she had. They brought out all of her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. So that again corresponds to what we had noted earlier as far as the archaeological evidence that was left over, the evidence of this burning of the city. Only the silver and gold, the vessels of bronze and iron were put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. And so she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Before we get there, sometimes I get ahead of myself. Again, looking at the archaeological finds of Jericho in connection with the promise to Rahab. There was a German excavation of Jericho that took place from 1907 to 1909. And this particular excavation found that on the north side of the city, there was a short stretch of the lower city wall that did not fall as it did everywhere else. Well, that's interesting. There was a portion of the mud brick wall that was still standing to a height of over 2 meters, which would be about 8 feet. What is more, there were houses built against that section of the wall that were still intact. Now again, where was Rahab's house? It was on the wall. So it's really just amazing to see that kind of evidence that shows the biblical account to be absolutely correct, down to the smallest detail. Another example of fulfilled promises is what we read in the last couple verses of chapter 6, specifically in verse 26. Where we find that Joshua pronounces a curse upon whoever would seek to rebuild the city of Jericho in the future. And so it says there, Joshua charged them at that time, saying, "Cursed be the man before the Lord who rises up and builds this city Jericho. He shall lay its foundation with his firstborn, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates." And so the idea is that the endeavor to accomplish the rebuilding would encompass or take the life of this person's firstborn and also his youngest child, whoever it would be. Well, is that what happened? Well, interestingly enough, it is. 1 Kings chapter 16, we read about when this actually took place, and it came to pass just as Joshua had said. In his days, we read there, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation with Abiram his firstborn, and with his youngest son Segub, he set up its gates. Notice, according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through Joshua, the son of Nun. And so, again, as we look at these things and see how these promises were made and see how they were fulfilled, it should remind us today of the promises that God has made to us and how sure and solid they truly are, and how much we can build our lives upon them. Hebrews chapter 6, that is brought out for us. In verse 9 there, beginning, the Hebrew writer says, "But beloved, we are confident of better things concerning you, yes, things that accompany salvation, though we speak in this manner. For God is not unjust to forget your work, your labor of love, which you have shown towards his name, in that you have ministered to the saints and do minister. We desire that each one of you show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope until the end, that you do not become sluggish, but imitate those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." And that's one of the wonderful things about the Old Testament, is that we can see so many different promises that God made and see the fulfillment of those promises. And of course that goes over into the New Testament as well. Many of those promises and prophecies had their ultimate fulfillment in the New Testament. But even in the Old Testament alone, we have so many examples that show us that God keeps his word, and that gives us hope today. And so I hope that these things have been beneficial to you this evening as we've looked at this account and seen some different things that we can learn from it. And perhaps we've been able to learn something that we didn't know before in connection with this particular account. We're about to sing the song that's been selected. If there's anyone here tonight who has a need in regards to making their lives right with God, we would love to assist you, whether that be obeying the gospel or asking for prayers. And so as we turn and sing the song that's been chosen, if you have a need, please let that be known while we stand and sing.